In the dimly lit auditorium of Memphis State College's music department, Professor Lawrence Thornton adjusted his bow tie and peered over his gold-rimmed spectacles at the young man who had just walked through the door. It was February 1957, and Elvis Presley, already a controversial star with hit records and scandalous television appearances, stood awkwardly in the entrance, dressed in a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual flashy stage wear. The professor's thin lips curled into a barely disguised smirk as he gestured to the empty seat at the front of the room. For months he had been publicly criticizing the Presley phenomenon as evidence of America's cultural decline, dismissing him as a talentless hip-shaker, corrupting the nation's youth with musical abominations. Now, through a twist of fate, he had the opportunity to humiliate the so-called king in front of his entire advanced music theory class. But what Professor Thornton couldn't possibly know was that in the next 30 minutes, his prestigious 40-year career would lie in shambles at his feet, and everything he thought he understood about musical genius would be forever shattered. "Mr. Presley," the professor began, his voice dripping with condescension that caused several students to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "How kind of you to grace our humble institution with your presence." The students exchanged nervous glances. Professor Thornton was legendary for his ruthless criticism and impossibly high standards. He had systematically destroyed the aspirations of countless students over his long career, and now he had set his sights on the biggest musical target of all. His plan was simple but devastating: to expose Elvis as a musical fraud through a series of increasingly difficult technical challenges that no self-taught musician could possibly navigate. The grand piano positioned at the center of the room wasn't there by accident. It was the centerpiece of an elaborate trap designed to publicly strip away Elvis's musical credibility once and for all. Elvis had reluctantly agreed to this unusual musical assessment at the urging of Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, who thought it might help counter the growing criticism from cultural elites. "Just go in there and be yourself, boy," the colonel had advised. "Answer his questions, play a little something, it'll be good publicity." But as Elvis took in the rows of serious-faced music students and the cold stare of Professor Thornton, what he couldn't have known was that Thornton had already written a scathing article for the Memphis Music Journal titled "The Death of American Musical Standards," with a blank space left for quotes from this very encounter, quotes designed to reveal Elvis's lack of formal training and theory knowledge. The trap was set, and everyone in the room knew it, everyone except the young man from Tupelo who was about to turn the tables in a way that would become legendary in the halls of Memphis State College. "Perhaps you could explain to my students the complex musical structures you employ in your compositions." Professor Thornton's question was the first salvo in his planned attack. "Or is keeping time to 3 basic chords the extent of your musical knowledge?" The room fell silent. Elvis, known for his polite demeanor off stage, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The professor allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. But what happened next would wipe that smile off his face and leave a room full of witnesses in complete shock. Instead of taking the bait and responding defensively, Elvis looked thoughtfully at the professor. "Sir, I never claimed to be formally trained. I just play what I feel and sing what moves me." His soft-spoken response caught Thornton off guard. He had expected anger, embarrassment, or fumbling excuses. Instead, he got humility. But the professor was not about to be deterred from his mission. He needed quotable material for his article, and he needed to show his students what real musical knowledge looked like compared to the primitive noise that teenagers were inexplicably drawn to. It was time to spring the trap he'd been setting since learning of Elvis's visit to campus. "Feelings," he scoffed, adjusting his bow tie with manicured fingers, "are not a substitute for actual musical knowledge. Perhaps you'd humor us with a demonstration of your technique." He gestured to the grand piano that sat in the center of the room. This was the moment he had been planning to force Elvis to demonstrate his lack of classical training in front of everyone. The professor had specifically requested the piano rather than a guitar, knowing it would put the young singer at a disadvantage. Several students leaned forward, some eager to witness the humiliation of a rock star, others uncomfortable with their professor's obvious hostility. What none of them realized was that they were about to witness a moment that would be whispered about in music schools for decades to come. Elvis hesitated for just a moment before walking to the piano. Was it nervousness? Intimidation? The professor certainly thought so. As Elvis sat down at the bench and flexed his fingers, Professor Thornton moved in for what he believed would be the kill shot. "Perhaps you could demonstrate your understanding of Bach's counterpoint techniques. The well-tempered clavier, Book 1 Prelude and Fugue in C minor should suffice." He named one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, certain that Elvis would be forced to admit he couldn't play it. Several students gasped at the unreasonable request. Even accomplished pianists spent years mastering Bach's complex fugues, but what Professor Thornton could never have anticipated was what happened next, a moment that would not only change the trajectory of this encounter, but would later force musicologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about America's most controversial musical icon. Elvis took a deep breath, positioned his hands over the keys, and after a moment of stillness, began to play. The familiar notes of Bach's prelude filled the room, executed with a sensitivity and technical precision that caused the professor's smug expression to freeze mid-smirk. But it was when Elvis seamlessly transitioned from the prelude into the intricate fugue, his fingers dancing across the keys with both flawless technique and emotional depth, that the professor's expression transformed from frozen confidence to visible shock. Students who had been expecting an embarrassing fumble sat up straight in their chairs, some exchanging wide-eyed glances, others staring open-mouthed at the spectacle before them. Professor Lawrence Thornton, who had spent decades dismissing popular music as technically primitive noise, was watching his entire worldview crumble in real time. But the most shocking moment was still to come. After completing the Bach piece with concert-level proficiency, Elvis paused for just a moment before launching into an improvised passage that incorporated elements of Bach's counterpoint, while gradually introducing blues progressions and gospel harmonies. He wasn't just playing Bach, he was creating a conversation between classical and contemporary forms right before their eyes, demonstrating not just technical skill but genuine compositional genius. The improvisation built to a climax that incorporated elements of gospel, classical, and what would soon be called rock and roll, all woven together in a musical tapestry that defied categorization. By the time Elvis finally lifted his hands from the keys, the room remained in stunned silence for several long seconds before erupting into spontaneous applause. Students rose to their feet, some with tears in their eyes. Everyone, that is, except Professor Thornton, who stood frozen at the front of the room, his entire academic identity collapsing around him. But how was this possible? How could this young man from a poor background, without formal conservatory training, possess such extraordinary musical gifts, and why had he kept these abilities hidden from the public? The answer lay in a story that few people knew then, and that has remained largely unknown even as Elvis's legend has grown over the decades. As the applause finally died down, Elvis turned to the still speechless professor and began to explain. "My parents couldn't afford music lessons," he said quietly, "but Mr. Muller taught me for free after he heard me singing on our porch. He said I had a gift that shouldn't go to waste just because we didn't have money." The students listened in rapt attention as Elvis revealed that while growing up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, his early musical education had come from an unlikely source, an elderly German immigrant named Friedrich Muller, who lived in his neighborhood during his early childhood. Muller, a former concert pianist who had fled Germany before World War II, had recognized something special in the young boy who would stop to listen whenever he played his piano with the windows open. 3 times a week for nearly 5 years, young Elvis would slip away to the old man's house, where he received a rigorous classical training that would have been the envy of any conservatory student. "He started me with Bach because he said if I could play Bach I could play anything," Elvis continued. "He used to tell me, 'Elvis, music is music. It doesn't matter if it's played in a concert hall or a church or a juke joint. What matters is if it moves the soul.'" When Muller passed away just before Elvis's 13th birthday, he left the boy his collection of classical scores and a handwritten book of music theory that Elvis had studied religiously, even as he absorbed the gospel music at his church and the blues from Beale Street. As Elvis spoke, the students hung on every word, but Professor Thornton seemed to be struggling to process what he was hearing. His face had gone from shock to confusion, and now showed the first signs of something even more unexpected: humility. Finding his voice at last, he asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "If you have this level of classical training, why do you choose to play the music you play?" There was genuine bewilderment in his voice, not just condescension. Elvis's answer would not only silence the professor completely, but would later be quoted in music textbooks as a pivotal moment in the understanding of American musical evolution. "Because that's the music that's living and breathing right now, sir," Elvis replied, his voice gaining confidence. Bach and Beethoven were writing for the people of their time, using the musical vocabulary that spoke to them. "I'm trying to do the same thing. The music I play, it's a conversation between gospel and rhythm and blues, between the spiritual and the physical. That's what people are feeling in 1957. With all due respect, sir, music isn't just in concert halls, It's in church pews and cotton fields and street corners. It's wherever people are using notes and rhythms to tell their stories. The room was completely silent now, the students witnessing not just a defense of popular music, but a philosophy of music itself that challenged everything their professor had taught them about the hierarchy of musical forms. A student in the back of the room, bolder than the rest, called out a request. "Can you show us how you compose your own music?" Professor Thornton, still reeling from the demolition of his planned humiliation, didn't even think to object. Elvis nodded and turned back to the piano. What followed was an even more remarkable demonstration, as Elvis showed how he combined elements from gospel church services, blues progressions, country ballads, and even classical structures to create his distinctive sound. He deconstructed his hit "Don't Be Cruel" to show its musical architecture, revealing sophisticated choices in harmony and rhythm that many of the formally trained students had never attempted. When he demonstrated how he'd incorporated a modified version of a Bach motif into the bridge of the song, several of the composition students began taking frantic notes. The young man they had been prepared to dismiss as a musical illiterate was delivering the most illuminating masterclass on composition many of them had ever witnessed. "Music theory isn't just rules written in books," Elvis explained as his fingers moved across the keys. "It's understanding why certain combinations of notes and rhythms make people feel something. That's what I'm chasing when I record or perform, that feeling. The technical part matters. You have to know the rules to break them in ways that work, but it's all in service to that connection with the listener." By now, Professor Thornton had sunk into a chair at the side of the room, watching silently as Elvis effectively took over his class. The musical hierarchies he had spent a lifetime defending, with Western classical music at the pinnacle and popular forms dismissed as crude simplifications, were being dismantled before his eyes by a young man he had planned to humiliate. But the most surprising twist in this remarkable encounter was still to come. As Elvis prepared to leave, the students crowded around him with questions and requests. Professor Thornton remained in his chair, seemingly lost in thought. Then, just as Elvis was about to exit the auditorium, the professor rose and approached him. The room quieted immediately, everyone anticipating a confrontation or perhaps a defensive reassertion of classical supremacy. Instead, Professor Lawrence Thornton, whose withering criticism had reduced generations of students to tears, extended his hand to Elvis Presley and said something that left his students as shocked as they had been by Elvis's playing. "Mr. Presley, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions based on prejudices that I didn't even realize I held." Elvis, ever gracious, shook the older man's hand. "No harm done, sir," he replied. "We're all just trying to make sense of how music is changing." Then, with a hint of the mischievous smile that had captivated audiences, he added, "Besides, I probably should thank you. Colonel Parker's been trying to get me to play classical pieces in my shows for months. After today, I might just try it." With that, he was gone, leaving behind a roomful of music students whose understanding of their chosen art form had been permanently altered, and a professor facing the most profound challenge of his career, reconciling everything he thought he knew about music with what he had just witnessed. The story of Elvis's triumph over Professor Thornton might have remained just a piece of Memphis state folklore had it not been for one of the students present that day, Jonathan Michaels, who would later become a respected music journalist. In 1977, following Elvis's death, Michaels published an account of the encounter in Rolling Stone magazine, revealing to the world the hidden classical prowess of rock and roll's biggest icon. The article, titled "The Bach Side of Elvis," prompted a re-evaluation of Elvis's musical legacy and led to the discovery of private recordings Elvis had made over the years, recordings that included classical pieces and experimental compositions that blended multiple genres in ways that were decades ahead of their time. But what was perhaps most remarkable about these recordings was that Elvis had never sought to release them publicly. They were created purely for his own artistic satisfaction, musical explorations that he engaged in privately even as his public persona became increasingly defined by his rockabilly hits and increasingly theatrical performances. Why had he kept this side of his musicianship hidden from the world? And how might music history have been different if he had integrated his classical abilities more openly into his public career? Professor Thornton, for his part, underwent a profound transformation after his encounter with Elvis. The following semester, he introduced a new course at Memphis State: American Vernacular Music, from field hollers to rock and roll. It was the first course of its kind at a major music department, examining the sophisticated musical structures in blues, jazz, gospel, and early rock music. Initially ridiculed by some of his colleagues, the course would eventually become a model for contemporary music studies programs across the country. When asked years later about his change of heart, Thornton, by then retired but still teaching occasional masterclasses, explained, "Elvis Presley taught me the most important lesson of my career, that I didn't actually understand what music is. I had confused tradition with truth, and academic pedigree with genius. True musical genius isn't about where or how you learn to play. It's about what you do with that knowledge, and whether what you create resonates in the human heart." The most profound impact, however, may have been on the students who witnessed the encounter that day. Many of them went on to careers that helped bridge the gap between classical and popular music traditions. Sarah Johnson, who had been a first-year theory student at the time, became a renowned composer whose works for orchestra incorporated elements of American roots music. Marcus Williams, a piano performance major who had been on the verge of dropping out, found new inspiration in Elvis's cross-genre facility and went on to become a session musician and educator, whose textbooks on American music theory would eventually replace Professor Thornton's own in many college curricula. "What I remember most," Williams recalled in a 2002 interview, "wasn't just how brilliantly Elvis played Bach. It was how he showed us that music isn't about rigid categories, it's a living, evolving language. He could speak classical fluently, but he chose to create a new dialect that combined everything from opera to gospel to blues. After that day, I never looked at any form of music as less than again." The most intriguing outcome of the encounter, however, was its effect on Elvis himself. According to people close to him, the validation of his classical abilities from someone within the academic establishment helped heal a deep-seated insecurity. Though he never abandoned his pop career to pursue classical performance, he did begin incorporating more complex musical structures into his compositions and arrangements. He also became more vocal in interviews about the diverse influences in his music, no longer downplaying his technical knowledge for fear of alienating his fan base. In 1968, when planning his famous comeback special for NBC, Elvis reportedly insisted on including a segment that would showcase his piano skills with a piece that subtly blended classical influences with contemporary sounds. Though network executives eventually convinced him to focus on his hits, bootleg recordings from rehearsals include a stunning improvisational piece that music theorists have since analyzed as incorporating elements of Chopin, gospel, and blues in a structure that presaged progressive rock by several years. What would have happened if Elvis had been allowed to present this side of himself to the television audience? Would it have changed his artistic trajectory and perhaps even extended his life by providing a more sustainable creative outlet than the Vegas spectacles that dominated his later years? Perhaps the most poignant footnote to this story comes from Elvis's private journal, excerpts of which were published in 2010. An entry from February 1957, presumably written shortly after the Memphis State encounter, reads, "Played for the professor today. Felt Mr. Muller there with me somehow. Wish he could have seen it. He always told me not to let anyone tell me what music I could or couldn't play, or where genius comes from. Said true music is about building bridges between people, not walls. Think he'd be proud. No, I still have so much to learn, but today I didn't feel like an imposter." This glimpse into Elvis's private thoughts reveals something crucial about his relationship with music, a relationship far more complex and thoughtful than his public image often suggested. While he embraced his role as a pop culture icon, he carried within him both the rigorous training of his early mentor and a deep understanding of music's power to transcend boundaries of class, race, and academic pedigree. The story of Elvis and Professor Thornton has become something of a parable in music education circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of musical elitism and the importance of recognizing that genius doesn't always arrive in expected packages or with the right credentials. It also offers a more nuanced understanding of Elvis Presley himself, not just as a performer who changed popular culture, but as a genuine musician whose choices were more deliberate and informed than many of his critics understood. In the decades since that February afternoon in 1957, popular music has gained increasing recognition in academic settings. University music departments now offer courses and degrees in jazz, rock, and other contemporary forms. The rigid hierarchy that placed Western classical music at the pinnacle of achievement has gradually given way to a more inclusive understanding of musical value and complexity. While many factors contributed to this evolution, the story of a young rock and roll star silencing a condescending professor with a perfect Bach fugue plays no small part in the narrative. For the students who witnessed that encounter, and for the millions who have since heard the story, the lesson extends beyond music. It's about questioning our assumptions about where excellence comes from. about recognizing that formal education is just one path to mastery, and about understanding that the most important qualities of genius may not be technical perfection, but the ability to synthesize diverse influences into something that speaks to the human condition in a new and powerful way. Elvis Presley never claimed to be a classical pianist or a musical theorist. He was content to be judged by the emotional impact of his music and its resonance with ordinary listeners. But for one extraordinary afternoon in Memphis, he pulled back the curtain on his hidden musical depths, revealing a complexity and sophistication that challenged everyone present to reconsider their definitions of musical genius. In doing so, he didn't just silence a critic, he helped change the conversation about American music itself. As we listen to the driving rhythms and passionate vocals of Elvis's greatest hits, it's worth remembering that behind those performances was a musician with a deep understanding of Bach's counterpoint, a pianist who could move effortlessly between classical fugues and gospel improvisations, and an artist who chose his musical path not because it was the only one available to him, but because it was where he believed music was most alive. The image of Elvis at the piano, fingers dancing through Bach's intricate patterns before building a bridge to something entirely new, stands as a perfect metaphor for American music itself, rooted in multiple traditions yet constantly evolving into fresh forms that reflect our collective experience. In the end, Professor Thornton's attempt to humiliate Elvis backfired in the most profound way possible. Instead of exposing a musical fraud, he unwittingly helped reveal a more complete truth that genius doesn't conform to our expectations or respect our boundaries. Sometimes, it arrives in blue suede shoes,